Hi everyone. So in the previous video we were covering what did we cover? Ternary conditional operator, and we came to learn some interesting things about it. And now we are here, Nil Coalescing operator, and this is interesting because as I looked into it before this video, I came to learn that it's an addition to the ternary conditional operator. Pretty much that's what it is. And obviously where it now becomes interesting is how do you work with a ternary conditional operator when you have an optional value. An optional, what is this? An optional. So yeah, that's what I was learning about it. So the Nil Coalescing operator, A, B, it's so easy, but yet where it comes from is so far. A, and then these question marks here. Now, I don't know what these question marks are called, actually. I don't know if the operator is these question marks or what. Because if these two question marks are like this, then we know we're talking about a Nil coalescing operator. Is it what it's called? Is this the symbol? And it seems like it is. This is the Nil coalescing operator. These two symbols like this define the Nil coalescing operator. So if we say, what is a Nil coalescing operator? Or show us or draw a Nil coalescing operator or type a Nil coalescing operator, pretty much we're saying, do these two question marks like that. That's a Nil coalescing operator. But then pretty much what it does here, it says it unwraps an optional A if it contains a value or returns a value B if A is nil. That's pretty much what it does. So let us put it to the test and see how it does this thing here. Okay, so in the previous video we did this thing here. So now let's say we create a variable called A and make this an integer. Okay, we can make this an optional like that. So now what we know about A is that it's a nil, because if I print A, it's nil. A is nil, but then what if I also do this? Okay, well, if it's now, I find this to be interesting because it's already a nil, which means it's giving us the value that is inside here. But then if I say 3 and I print this, it says an optional, and then this optional has wrapped 3 inside of it. And now when I do this, I'm force unwrapping it. So I'm unwrapping it, and then we get the 3. What if I do a question mark? But the question marks, it declares this as an optional. So if I put a question mark, I'm not doing it the right way. Okay, so this is not the right word, the right symbol to use. But then, yeah, what we do know here is that I'm force unwrapping this thing. So instead of me just getting an A, which is an optional, because the thing about this is that if I declare a variable called B, and I say B is equal to 1 or 12 plus A, we know A is equal to 3, right? But if I try to work on this, it's not going to work, because what essentially it's doing, it's say A 1 plus optional 3. That's what it's doing, and it's wrapped. That's the problem with it. Int must be unwrapped before. So then if I unwrap it, then that means I'm removing all these here, and then I'm only left with 3. So now it works well. So now with this thing here, for example, if I print let's say A or B. Oh, since I don't have B, I'll just put a 1. So what I'm saying here is that if A is a nil, if A is a nil, print 1. If A is not a nil, print 3. That's pretty much what I'm saying. So we should get 3 as the answer, which is what we're seeing here. But then now the interesting thing about this, what is this? Let me write it down so that I don't forget it. What is it called again? A Nil Coalescing operator. It looks something along these lines. There's a Nil Coalescing operator. So now the thing about this is that it's going to unwrap this A somewhere here. So now, and I find it interesting because obviously this Nil Coalescing, let's do this. Let's say symbol is let's say returns value true. It does return a value. What else can we say? Okay, that's it. The expression is A, B, where A is an optional. That's what we learn about it, okay? So let's see the next step. So now I'm able to do this. So now I can do this thing here, but then in order for me to do this, previously, the way we were doing it, we were saying A, then we're doing a question mark, and then we're saying, what are we saying there? A. This is how we were to do it. Or 1. This is how we were to do it. Oh, but then A. But then A needs to be unwrapped first. Oh, but then here A is not what is this? So then that means, should I put it inside an if? Because it needs to return a true or false, but then an if statement cannot do that. So how do I do this? And I can't do this because it doesn't evaluate to a true or false. This statement here. Okay, so then the best way to do it is this way. We can say if A is equal to a nil, which this returns a true or a false. And if it returns a true, then we're going to go inside the statement. If it returns a false, then we're going to execute this one here. So now it should give us a 1. Now, why is it giving us? Oh, it's not nil. If it's not nil, then now we're getting a 3, a nice 3 here. So what we're saying, because this should return a Boolean value. Now, okay, there's no need to do these things. Why would you want to over sophisticated things? Chico Matlala man cannot convert. I don't even know why I needed to do this, but then okay, we will learn these things. So far, I've learned that this means something, and I think it terminates the expression, the line, and then these also mean something. They have a way in which they're defined, and we'll get to it with time. But then that's what we see right now. So this statement is equivalent to this statement. These two statements are the same, because what we're doing here, we're saying if A is not nil, then print A, but then also unwrap it, right? But then if A is nil, then print 1. But then here's where it gets interesting again. Now, can I print a string here? Oh, let me say A is nil. A is nil. Because what I'm learning here is that I can print a string. But then here, I cannot print a string. Let's see. Okay, let's see. So now, if this is a nil, it says A is nil. And then it still says A is nil. When there was a point where I was trying to return a value, but then it was not working. I think it was one of the previous videos, and I forgot how I got to that error. Because here we know this is an int. This is an int. But then now let me say this then. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, let's say var and then create a new variable called b, make it an integer is equal to 2. Okay, and then we say print, right? We say, okay, well, let me create this thing here, var bool value is equal to false. B or not working. Okay, but it works fine. I got an error at one point trying to do this, and it was telling me that because obviously we know the return type of this. Now, when this is false, it's going to return a string. When this is true, it's going to return an integer. Not working. But if I say true, it now returns an integer. How did I ever... Whatever was I doing? Okay, I think I was trying to assign it into a value. That's what happened. That's what happened. Because now if I say var c, which is an integer, is equal to this, then I think that's where we got the issue now, that this thing has a possibility of returning a string, and we're assigning that string into an integer. Or even if I do it this way, it has a possibility of returning either a string or an integer, and it cannot infer to them both. It needs to infer only to one data type. Now it's saying there's a possibility that I might be an integer, there's a possibility that I might be a variable. Then the best option to do this is to make it of any data type. Then we should not have the error anymore. But if I do it this way and I say it's an integer, then essentially it's throwing an error now, because it's saying there's a possibility that this may be evaluated back to a string or an integer, and it's a problem. It's a problem because I need one. Therefore, if I'm going to infer this, then I'm either going to infer to A, which we know is an integer, or B, which we do know. But here's where it gets interesting again. As much as we know that A is an integer, it's also an optional. There's a thing about it. Either I'm going to have to unwrap this A so that it reveals the integer within it, then it can give us the value that we need. But if I do it this way, then what I'm bringing out, what I'm returning, is an optional. And we know that this int is not an optional except if I do this. But then we should get another error here with B, because B is not an optional. Okay, but well, B is not an optional, but B is an integer. So which means we're fine. Yeah, B is an integer. That's fine. And A is an integer and is an optional integer. So which means we can which means two of them evaluate to true. This is both an integer, which this is an integer. This is both an integer and an optional, which is here. So now let's see what's going to be the value of C. Now it says an optional of 2, which now took the value B. So now if I say this is false, it's still going to return a nil, and the nil starts from here. But then now, because this is also an optional, it can take the nil. So that's the interesting thing about this. I think it's cool. Let me not get carried away. Let's see what else we need to know. The expression is the expression A is always of a type of an optional type. Okay, the expression A is always of an optional type. So whenever we work with Nil coalescing operator, the first operand. Not an operand, sorry. Yeah, the first operand needs to be an optional. It cannot not be an optional. Because ultimately we have to unwrap an optional. So then that means if I say this, var d, which is an int, is equal to 3, and then I try to do something like this. I try to say print d is not an optional. You see, it's not going to work because it's saying, but then it did print, and it printed it with a warning. Okay. In other words, because this is not an optional, because D is not an optional, it always returns a true. And that's where it gets interesting. I think that's the warning that they're trying to give us here, that since this is not an optional, since D is not an optional, this statement will never get executed because it will never be false. In other words, it will never be nil. And because it is never a nil, this default will never get executed. So which means this statement is as good as being this way forever, if I'm understanding it correctly. It's as good as being this way forever. Okay, let's see. The code above uses a ternary conditional operator and forced unwrapping to access the value wrapped inside A when A isn't nil, and to return B otherwise. The Nil Coalescing operator provides a more elegant way to encapsulate this additional checking and unwrapping in a concise and readable form. Okay. Note, if the value A is non-nil, the value B isn't evaluated. This is known as short circuit evaluation. Okay. I find it interesting because we have inference. Inference means we deduce, or we reason, or we conclude that something is of a specific type because of the contents within that variable. Now there's something called a short circuit evaluation. Now, short circuit evaluation says if the value A is non-nil, the value B is not evaluated. It pretty much takes us back to what we talked about, that this because D is not an optional, it always returns true. Therefore, the default, I'll just call it the default now, the default value is never evaluated. This is, what is it called? Short circuit evaluation. Okay, let's see. The example below uses the Nil Coalescing operator to choose between a default color name and an optional user-defined color name. And I think one of the reasons why I use the word default